Listen. I am Mama Otomba, and I still remember the night the music began to bleed through the walls of Harlem, like a wound that refused to close. The year was 1957, and the winter air carried the scent of burning coal, cheap whiskey, and something older than both, something my grandmother used to call the breath of forgotten spirits. I was already old then, living above a narrow jazz club on 133rd Street, where the musicians played as if they were trying to outrun their own shadows. And that was where I first heard him, the musician, who played for the dead. It started with a single note, a trumpet note so low and sorrowful it made the glass in my window tremble, like it recognized a name it had long forgotten. I went downstairs thinking perhaps one of the men had come early to practice, but when I entered the club it was empty except for the dim glow of the stage light, and a man standing there holding a trumpet that looked too old to belong to any living hand. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel him looking at me as if he had been waiting for me longer than I had been alive. He played again without speaking, and this time the sound carried images, not music, but visions of a desert I had never seen, and yet somehow remembered: red sand stretching endlessly beneath a black sun, and figures dancing around a fire that burned without heat. I should have left, but something in my blood, something my ancestors buried deep inside me, told me to stay. The man stopped playing and said in a voice like rusted iron breaking that he had been sent by someone I once knew in the old world. In the place where spirits walk openly among men, he called me by a name I had not heard since my childhood in West Africa, a name I had buried after crossing the ocean. I felt the room grow colder as he spoke of a debt unpaid, of a song stolen from the dead and brought here to Harlem, where music was both salvation and curse. I asked him who he was, and he only smiled and said he was the last musician of a forgotten court, where kings ruled not over land, but over echoes. And then he began to play again. This time the sound did not enter my ears, but my bones, and I saw them, the dead, rising not from graves, but from music itself, men in suits from another century stepping out of saxophone shadows, women in beads and ash, dancing in slow circles around invisible fires. I stepped back, but the door behind me had vanished, and the club stretched longer than it should have, deeper than any building in Harlem had the right to be. The musician told me that every song ever played leaves a trace in the world, and some traces never die, they wait. They hunger, and in Harlem the hunger had grown too strong to remain silent. I realized then that this was not a man but a vessel, something that carried voices from the other side, where music was law and rhythm was judgment. I asked him what he wanted from me, and he said only this: that I must remember the original song, the one my ancestors buried when they crossed oceans as slaves and survivors, because that song was the key to stopping what was coming through him, and through every trumpet, every saxophone, every drum that had ever called out in grief or joy. But remembering is never simple when the past has teeth. And as he spoke, I felt my grandmother's stories rising in my mind, stories of desert spirits who fed on sound, of ancestral kings who sealed away music so powerful it could wake the sleeping gods beneath the earth. And I understood then why Harlem was chosen, why this place of jazz and struggle and endless nights had become a doorway. Because here music was not just art, it was survival, and survival always comes with a price. The musician stepped closer, and I saw his eyes for the first time. They were not human. They were deep wells filled with spinning notes and broken melodies, and he told me that soon the club would be full again, not with living men but with everything their music had ever called forth, unless I agreed to listen, truly listen, to the song I had tried to forget. Since childhood I felt fear rise in me like a tide, but beneath it something older answered, something that remembered drums under African moons and voices calling spirits home. I closed my eyes, and for the first time I let the music come, not as sound, but as memory, and in that moment I saw the truth of him. He was not the musician who played for the dead, he was what the dead became when they had no rest. And Harlem, my Harlem, was about to become his stage, and as the final note of that impossible trumpet echoed through the empty club, I realized that whatever came next would not only decide the fate of this city, but the balance between silence and song itself, and I knew I could not leave because the dead were already listening. The moment the last note faded, the air in the club changed, as if the building itself had inhaled something it should never have tasted. and I felt the floor beneath me soften like wet earth, even though I knew it was still polished wood from decades of spilled liquor and dancing shoes. The musician stood motionless on the stage, but the trumpet in his hands began to move on its own, turning slowly as if it were listening to something far beneath the city, and I understood then that silence here was not absence but presence, a kind of waiting intelligence that had been disturbed. I opened my eyes fully, and saw that the empty tables were no longer empty. Faint outlines of men in suits and women in evening dresses had begun to gather, as if the club was remembering its past nights. All at once, every conversation ever spoken here, rising like smoke, refusing to disperse. And among them I recognized faces that should not have been in Harlem at all, faces painted in ash and sand eyes too old for any American street. The musician finally spoke again without moving his lips, telling me that I had touched the edge of remembrance, and now the edge would not let me go. He said, "The song I carried was not mine, but inherited like a curse passed through bloodlines that survived chains and oceans." And as he spoke, the trumpet lifted itself and pointed toward me like a judgment. I felt my grandmother's presence behind me, even though she had been dead for 30 years. Her voice like dry wind telling me not to resist what was already inside me, and then I heard it faint at first, a rhythm. Beneath my heartbeat, a pattern. My ancestors once used to call spirits from the desert into the circle of fire. The musician smiled as if he had been waiting for that exact moment, and told me that every culture that survives suffering learns to sing to what hunts it, but sometimes the hunting never stops, and the song becomes a door instead of a shield. The walls of the club began to stretch again, this time dissolving into dunes of red sand that pressed against the edges of reality like a memory refusing to be forgotten. I was no longer standing in Harlem, but somewhere between places, a threshold where geography no longer mattered, and in that shifting space I saw the origin of the musician, not as a man, but as a gathering of echoes shaped into human form by centuries of stolen sound. He showed me visions without touching me of ancient courts buried beneath desert skies, where kings did not rule with weapons but with melodies that could command wind and summon ancestors from beneath stone. And then he showed me the breaking of that world when a forbidden song was played for power instead of balance, awakening something beneath the earth that consumed both music and silence alike. I realized that what stood before me was not simply a warning, but a consequence still unfolding, and Harlem was only the newest stage for an ancient mistake. The musician stepped closer, and the trumpet dissolved into ash and reformed again, as if it could not decide what instrument it wanted to be. And he told me that the dead do not arrive without invitation. They come through rhythm, through repetition, through memory that refuses to die. And Harlem was drowning in memory. Every jazz solo ever played here had become a thread pulling something upward from the other side. I tried to speak, but my voice came out layered with other voices, some young, some ancient, all of them, mine and not mine. And I finally understood why I had been chosen, because I had lived long enough to remember what others had forgotten. The old protection songs, the ones my grandmother whispered while grinding herbs under moonlight to keep wandering spirits from following us across the ocean. The musician raised his hand and the club collapsed back into itself, returning us to the dim wooden room, but nothing was truly the same. The air now hummed like a held breath, and he told me I had two choices, though in truth there was never choice in such matters. Either I would remember the full song and seal the opening that was forming beneath Harlem, or I would let the music complete itself, and allow the dead to step fully into this world where they would no longer be bound by memory alone. As he spoke, I felt something moving beneath the city, not underground in soil, but underneath sound itself, like a second Harlem, built entirely from forgotten notes and unresolved chords. I closed my eyes again and let the rhythm rise fully, this time not resisting. And in that surrender I saw the moment my ancestors hid the song, not from enemies, but from themselves. Because it was too powerful to remain whole in a world built on suffering, they broke it into fragments and scattered it across generations, across oceans, across voices like mine. And now those fragments were trying to return to each other through jazz, through blues, through every sorrowful note played in this city since the first club opened its doors. When I opened my eyes, the musician was no longer smiling, because he understood I was beginning to remember too quickly, and that remembering always has a cost. The trumpet in his hands began to scream without sound, and the dead around us leaned closer as if the performance was about to begin in earnest. And I knew then that part one had only been the opening note of something far larger, something that would not stop until either the song was whole again, or the world itself learned how to be silent. The trumpet's silent scream did not fade when the sound stopped. It stayed inside the air like a bruise on reality, and I felt it pressing against my chest, as if the room itself was trying to remember how to become a door. The musician stepped back slowly, as though even he was no longer fully in control of what he had summoned, and for the first time I saw fear in something that was not human, yet wore human shape. The dead around us were no longer just outlines or echoes. They were becoming heavier, more defined, their presence no longer tied to memory but to intent. And I understood then that the song was reaching completion. Whether I wanted it or not, Harlem outside that club was still alive, still laughing, still bleeding music from every corner street, but beneath it another rhythm had begun to rise. A second Harlem made entirely of unresolved sound, and I could feel it pressing upward like hands against a lid. The musician whispered that I had waited too long, that remembering was not meant to be complete, only balance. But I was already too deep inside the ancestral rhythm to stop. I could hear my grandmother now, not as memory but as voice, standing beside me, telling me the final truth she never dared say in life, that the song was never protection alone. It was also prison, and what had been locked away was not only spirits, but consequences. I raised my hands without knowing I was doing it, and the club began to dissolve again, but this time, not into desert or memory, but into sound itself. Every surface becoming vibration, every shadow becoming tone, and I saw Harlem from above as if I were standing on the edge of the world, every jazz club, a flickering candle in a vast darkness, each one feeding the same invisible current beneath the city. The musician tried to stop me by playing again a desperate broken sequence of notes, meant to fracture my focus, but the notes no longer obeyed him. They bent toward me instead, like iron filings drawn to something buried in my blood, and I realized the original song was not a melody but a structure, a pattern of restraint woven into rhythm, a way to keep the boundary between living and dead from collapsing under emotion. Grief and memory and Harlem had become too emotional, too alive with sorrow and joy for the seal to hold. The dead were not invading, they were responding. I stepped forward and touched the trumpet, and in that instant I saw everything the musician had been: not a man, not even a vessel, but a wound that never closed across centuries. Every time music was misused, every time sound was taken as power instead of balance, he reformed somewhere in the world, drawn again to places like Harlem, where music burns brightest and most dangerously, and I felt pity for him, even as I understood I had to end it. I began to sing then, not with my voice alone, but with every fragment of the buried song returning through me. It hurt like memory, tearing through bone, but it was also clarity. And as I sang, I felt the dead hesitate, not out of fear, but recognition, as if hearing something they had been waiting for since their own deaths. The club trembled, not collapsing, but aligning like a broken instrument, slowly retuning itself. And the musician screamed silently as his form began to unravel, not destroyed but released, because he was never meant to exist in permanence, only as warning, as echo, as correction. And I understood too late that saving Harlem would not mean silencing the dead, but teaching them how to be part of the song without breaking it. The final note I sang was not loud, it was whole. And in that wholeness, the city beneath the city finally closed its mouth. The pressure lifted like a tide retreating, and suddenly I was standing in the empty jazz club again, dawn light creeping through broken blinds, dust floating like tired ghosts who finally had nowhere left to go. The musician was gone, but on the stage lay a single bent trumpet that looked like it had survived something it never agreed to enter. I knew the balance would not hold forever. Music always returns to places where it is loved too deeply. But for now the dead were quiet, not gone, not freed, simply resting in the space between notes where they belonged. I sat down then, finally feeling the weight of my age again, and I understood that my task was not to end the Harlem, but to listen for when it began to sing too loudly again. Because somewhere in the world another musician would always begin to play for the dead, and when that happened, someone like me would have to remember the song all over again.